Thank you very much for coming to the screening. Anthony, don't you think it's a deliberate ploy for the festival to actually schedule the film to start at 2:30? Because people would have eaten lunch, and then they wouldn't feel too hungry, looking at the Hokkien mee and all that, right?
Yeah, but
beginning at the end of it.
But at the same time, I'm also worried, when the film is long, it's my longest film, and what if people fall asleep?
No, I don't think so. Because actually, well, I was talking about this because I noticed that food plays a very prominent part in all these three films. I mean, in this film, of course, with the Hokkien mee, with Wet Season, with the durian, and in Ilo Ilo, there are the Filipino sweets that Terry actually offered.
And the chicken.
The boiled chicken. So, is it deliberate? I mean, to have so much food on show? I mean, there must be a reason, right?
I have to say two things, right? Which is, there are only two things I love in my life, It's cinema and food. Apart from making films, the only thing I'm good at is cooking. I'm a very, very good cook. Okay. And I'm shameless enough to say that, And then I would say that food in Singapore is what unites the nation. I was lamenting to a lot of my friends, back home in Singapore, that in Singapore, if one day or, there's no more Singapore literature books, it's fine, Like if there's no more Singapore-made TV, film, cinema, it's fine. Singapore music, it's fine. Because we grew up on so much, we are very English-speaking. We grew up on so much Hollywood, American, British TV and film and literature and all that anyway. But if you were to take Singaporean food, the chicken rice, the Hokkien mee, the char kway teow and all that out, I can tell you'll see protests in the streets like the next day. I think food is what really unites. I think food is almost like our national identity. And the Hokkien mee that you see, Fujian chao, xia mian, you only find that in Singapore. You don't even have that in Malaysia. And it's one of my favorite dishes. And I cook it very well.
That's why you kept on saying that, well, you might be stopped making films because you have this second career all set up, right?
No, I mean, during the pandemic, I literally thought to myself, if cinemas close forever and that's the end of it, I'm going to go to La Cordon Bleu in Paris, in France, and I would train to be a chef. I mean, I literally decided that, But we are still here, and cinema is still alive, and thankfully cinema is still alive.
Because actually I brought this up not just to be flippant, but actually what I was trying to say how each and every little thing in Anthony's films, they meant so much because you spend so much time writing your screenplays, and I do believe that every little bit of minutiae actually matters. I mean, there must be some kind of a symbol, some kind of a meaning that, well, maybe we can get into that later on. Okay, but maybe before we begin, I must introduce you because you've got so many hats apart from being a good cook. So maybe I should really introduce you before we begin our conversation. So Anthony actually graduated from Ngee Ann Polytechnic in Singapore, where you majored in film and media studies. And even your graduate film, Anthony's graduate film, G23, which revolves around three characters in the cinema, actually won awards at the Asiana International Short Film Festival in Korea, and also the Festival International de Film Indépendant in Brussels. And actually the second film got even better for Anthony, Amour, which revolves around a family gathering at the deathbed of a matriarch, secured a special mention at the Cannes Film Festival. Your third short film, Haze, actually also was nominated for Best Short Film at the Berlinale, the Berlin International Film Festival. So after finishing military service, Anthony went to London to study at the National Film and Television School, where he made several short films and started planning and writing what would become Ilo Ilo, his first feature. And of course, now that we know, I mean, the rest is history. Ilo Ilo won the Camera d'Or, the best first film at the Cannes Film Festival, and also Best Feature, Best Original Screenplay, and Best Supporting Actress awards at the Golden Horses. And then Wet Season followed in 2019, the second film of the Growing Up trilogy, with Yo Yan Yan actually winning Best Actress at the Golden Horses as well. And the trilogy, of course, concluded with the film you just saw, We Are All Strangers, which premiered at Berlin International Film Festival in competition. And also, Anthony directed The Breaking Ice, a film set in northeastern China. It was in 2022. It premiered at Cannes Film Festival. Anthony also directed the English language film Drift, starring a pre-Wicked, Cynthia Erivo. It actually premiered at Sundance, also in competition, right? So actually,
no, it premieres.
It premiered at Sundance. Yeah, at the gala section. And also Anthony is a very prominent producer of Asian films. Among the films that he produced is the omnibus film Distance, the Thai film Arnold is a Model Student, the Indonesian films The City is a Battlefield from last year, Muli Suria's film, Edwin's film Sleep No More, which, if I'm correct, is also featured at Hong Kong International Film Festival this year, and also Camilla Andini's Four Seasons in Java, which I'm sure will pop up at the main festival very soon. So it's a very long CV. But I think I need to tell the audience all these details because, well, in a conversation later, probably we're going to touch on all this. But of course, we are going to talk about, well, the conversation will be conducted in the context of the Growing Up trilogy. Because actually, well, the film We Are All Strangers is screened here as this section dedicated to your three films. So the Growing Up trilogy, I think you coined this term, I think after the first film or after the second film, but when did this idea actually come up?
It really came after the second film. You know, I made my first film. I discovered this boy, Xu Jiale, Ko Jiale. You know, we saw 8,000 children, you know, in 21 schools. I ran workshops for like 10 months and you know, he emerged out of those workshops. There were 300 kids that went through my workshops, and in the end, you know, he was in the final 10, and we casted him. He was very, very naughty when he was young, difficult to work with, and I still remember my assistant director, who worked with me throughout all these three films, you know, was joking, saying, "Oh yeah, you know, like maybe you might end up filming him until he grows up." And I said, "Yeah, yeah, yeah." And sure enough, it happened, you know. On the second film, Wet Season, I did the same thing. We went to a lot of secondary schools. We looked at a lot of 15, 16-year-old kids, hundreds of them. They came into my workshops again. You know, I'm very performance-driven, so I do a lot of workshops myself. You know, I literally can teach non-actors to act. You know, I found my own methodology, basically. And we couldn't find the right one. And then my casting director, you know, and we sort of rediscovered Jiale on Instagram, you know, because when he was young, he was a little bit short and a little bit round, you know, chubby. And yeah, and then we saw this kid on Instagram and we were like, oh, maybe this kid looks interesting, you know. And then it was he had went on to do this 60-part TV series about, you know, like a high school drama on the local TV station. And then there was this picture, and I didn't recognize him, and then we investigated, and oh, that's your actor for your first film. So, you know, we caught him and then brought him back, and same thing, did the workshops. Actually, in 5 to 10 minutes, we looked at one another and we decided it's him, you know, because there's something so special, you know, there is an innate talent, you know. And I casted him, and because of that, I didn't want to cast Yo Yan Yan, because they played mother and son in the first film, and in the second film, I was thinking like, this sounds so incestuous, because it was about a teacher and student having an intimate relationship. And then I sort of auditioned and tried other actresses, and eventually, and Yen Yen also asked me, like, you've been like looking at a lot of people. Singapore is very small, you've been meeting everyone. Why haven't you called me? And eventually I brought her in, and I was still not convinced. So we did some scenes, and eventually, we casted her, and we made it work. At the end of the second film, I was saying, like, it's such a chore, like to go in circles and then eventually land onto the same two actors again. So on the third film, I decided I'm not going to spend all that time. I'm just going to, if fate leads us together, I'm going to complete this growing up trilogy, and we've seen this kid at 11, we've seen this kid, in the second film in secondary school. He was playing a 16-year-old boy, and then now this is a 21-year-old, young adult. We're going to film his coming of age. He perhaps is my John Pierre Liu, if you know Truffaut's, like wonderful classic, The 400 Blows, and he worked with this same actor. Not just 3 films. I think he made many more films than that.
I think a short film and maybe 4 features.
Yeah. But I think this is the end, huh? I don't think there'll be a 4th film.
Never say never, right? But actually, you're right. I mean, after watching these 3 films, or maybe even after the second film, I was sort of thinking whether the Antoine Doinel films were an inspiration for you in terms of, following a character, even though, Jiala's character is not exactly the same character, but it's still tracing the same boy and through his journey through life. So that was an inspiration, or no? Or was it just coincidence?
No, The 400 Blows it's one of my favorite films. Like every time Sight and Sound asks me to do the top 10 list, like every 5 years it's still on the list. It hasn't dropped out yet. Certain films will be replaced. But that is always on the list. I was looking for, my Singaporean Antoine. I was looking for a face that was unique enough that you wanted to look at it, and at the same time, I don't think Jiala, especially when you saw him as a kid, like you wouldn't say he's like the most good-looking face or whatever, but there's something about it where, there was an ambiguity there. You felt like there was story, like that a filmmaker could, if this was a canvas, it was a face that a filmmaker could use to paint. And that was what I was looking for. There was a sense of fragility. There was a sense of fracture. There was something about something is not quite right. But what is it? And that intrigues me.
I think the similarity also lies between, how Antoine Doinel is all about, Leo's character trying to find a way to reconcile or reintegrate himself into society, and failing. And in a way, looking at these 3 films is also about Jiala's different characters, trying to do that. Looking for some kind of a belonging, looking for some kind of an identity in Singaporean society. Would that be also a similarity that I could actually?
Yeah, I think you could say that. To be really honest, it's a real challenge working with Jiala over, all this time. And why I say that, it's like, I think he's a lot of talent, but he's a very reluctant actor. I remember in January last year, I called him into the office because I was going to start shooting in March, and I really warned him months in advance, like, we're going to make the next film, you need to be ready, He put on so much weight. If I were to show you the picture of what he looks like, in January last year, you'd be shocked. He lost 15 kilos for this role. Not because he wanted to lose it, was because I forced him to lose it. Because I said, this is completely unfilmable, And he was a reluctant actor. I said, you know, I love acting, but every time I make a film with you, I have to lose weight, I have to watch what I eat. I like to enjoy. He's a little bit like Jun Yang in the film. You know, he's happy-go-lucky, very free, doesn't like to be construed. And he said, you know, and he sleeps late, and, you know, like he doesn't take care of his skin, you know, things like that. And every time he said, every time I make a film with you, I have to do this, and then we have to go to festivals, and then I can't eat again. I have to look presentable. I have to wear a suit. You know, there are all these things which he's a reluctant actor. And it's you know, on the second film, on Wet Season, contractually, we had to sign a clause, and the last clause in the contract is he had to stay at my home.
Why was that?
Because he can't wake up. So every day at 10 p.m., you know, I mean, he was 17 at the time. At 10 p.m., I would confiscate his phone. I said, no more games. I'll put it down. I said, you go to sleep. And every morning at 5:30 or 6 o'clock, I wake him up and I bring him to set. Because if you leave him to his own devices, he might be late for 2 hours. And then, so on the third film, this film, I was thinking, boy, yeah, like when we were filming, you know, he was 24, you know, he just turned 25 a few months ago. And I said, you're a big boy now, you know, I can't basically, you know, have to take care of you the way I take care of you when you were much younger. And then I still remember one day, you know, because he had to lose all this weight, so I got, you know, a friend who is a doctor, you know, so to sort of medically help us, you know, like, so there were certain pills or whatever that could help the process. So we set an appointment, so I was there at 10 a.m. in the morning. He arrived at 12 noon. And for 2 hours, I called my casting team. I said, like, and they called him, and they couldn't get him.
Where was he?
He was sleeping.
At your place?
He was sleeping at home, you know. So, and that was, yeah, so later on, you know, like, same thing contractually, he had to move to the office. You know, we were doing the film out of this house, this production office, you know, upstairs. There were beds and rooms where, you know, like some of the overseas crew would stay. So he slept in the same room as my two assistant directors. You know, there were 3 beds, and every day they would wake him up. So,
I wonder what the rehearsals would be like, I mean, between him and Yeo Yan Yan, because Yeo Yan Yan, of course, comes from a very different end of the acting spectrum altogether, a professional actor for more than 2 decades, with a lot of experience in different kinds of films, and then Jala with, well, so a happy-go-lucky, reluctant actor. So how did you actually reconcile these these differences when you worked with them? I mean, in preparing for these films.
You know, like when that's the interesting thing. You know, when you have a boy who is inherently, you know, I think he's changing because after this film, something changed. You know, all of a sudden he said, "I think I want to be an actor." But inherently, he can be quite lazy. But he's got real talent. Yeo Yan Yan would forget her lines. Ko Jala would not forget his lines. But he would forget to bring the script. So he would never bring the script. But he would never forget his lines. 1 take, 2 takes, like the lines are there. It's like there's some natural talent or gift. But yeah, but it's quite interesting. Like I say, he's a reluctant actor. But on this film, it took about 2 weeks of filming or 3 weeks of filming, and all of a sudden, it clocked in for him. You know, all of a sudden, I saw this boy grow up. You know, for the first time, he was taking charge. He started to analyze the scene with me. He started to talk about, I don't think this character would say this line. He started to talk about motivation. He started to be coaching the other actors on set. And all of a sudden, he found his craft and his voice, and he was able to sort of, Yeah, and it's quite fascinating. You know, like there's a natural talent and gift. You know, and I have a feeling. Yeah, it would slowly. I don't know. He says that he's gonna be an actor now, and he asked like, "Oh, am I gonna make another film?" I said, "Maybe not with you."
But actually, how you said so much about how you changed Jala in more ways than one, but how did actually working with an actor like Jala change you? I mean, your approach in filmmaking, or working with actors, or maybe even writing your stories, or preparing your script or ideas?
I work very differently with different actors. So when it's trained actors like Yo Yan Yan, you know, she went to drama school. She trained as an actor from a young age. She started on stage in theater, and then she went on to do television, films. So I actually have different ways of working with actors. The thing with Singapore is because Singapore is very small. Singapore is like, 5.5 million people. There isn't a huge sort of like a community of actors or screen talent. So I always use a mixture of trained actors and non-actors. And I always find, like, I always sort of develop my own methodology to train non-actors. I mean, when we started, you know, when he was a kid, you know, like, I don't think Jia Le could cry or anything, you know, and I had my own exercises, you know, I sort of like over time created my own methodology. And so, for example, in the film that you just saw, it's a mixture of non-actors and actors. For example, the two loan sharks that you saw, the Da Long, you know, like, they were non-actors. I mean, they were not loan sharks, but they work at a KTV, you know, at some club, and my casting brought them in, and I worked with them and gave them the lines, and then we practiced a few times, and that's my process, you know. It's always I always feel like directing is almost like a conductor, where you have a symphony of players, but what you're doing is you're sort of like finding a certain balance. So, you know, like when you have got the method actors or the trained professionals that sometimes they overact or you see too much craft, you pull them back, and then you have to push the non-actors so that they are not just flat, you know, and it's basically trying to control this symphony, and that's what I do, which is why I find it particularly tiring and sort of like laborious when I make a film in Singapore. Because of this talent pool, every time I make a film, it's, you know, like 14 years ago when I shot Ilo Ilo to now, nothing has changed. You know, I still have to train non-actors. I still have to rehearse with non-actors. I still have to sort of like do that myself, you know, instead of having just, you know, quality supporting actors, beat players that you could just pick, you know, you get reels, you know, whether when I make a film in Europe or in China, and they just come in for the day and they step up to it, you know. It's very tiring because you end up being very, very hands-on, but at the same time, I mean, I love actors, you know. I think people that have seen my films would know, you know, I care a lot about performance. Maybe because it's my background. I was involved in children's theater at a very young age, so I was acting on stage from 10 to 19. In fact, there was a period of time where at 19, I think, I was in a drama series in Singapore. And
you nearly signed up to be a TV actor.
Yeah, I nearly signed up to become a full-time artist at the TV station, you know, a full-time actor, and thank God I didn't. You know, I would be so mediocre.
But it was during that time that you, by means of practicing acting and also witnessing how directors coach actors, young actors, or maybe in TV, that you developed your own methodology in terms of working with actors of different calibers and backgrounds. Is that so?
Yeah, I think it's that, but at the same time, I've worked out my my process about performance, you know, a lot of times, of course, you know, if you've been to acting school or directing and all that, you learn about motivation and all that. But for me, I've distilled it, you know, in simple terms, which is all performance and emotion, you know, it lies between the breaths and the pauses. And people go like, oh, what do you mean? So for example, you know, when you say a line, whether how you breathe and how you pause actually changes the emotion of that line. So for example, I can say like, it's a simple line, right? I love you, like, oh, I love you. But if I were to just change that pause, I love you. Emotionally, it just lands differently. Which is why I always tell actors, stop playing the line. Because the performance is not about the line. You know, that same line you can say in 1 million situations, but it's not just playing the right motivation, but also it's where you pause and where you breathe. So sometimes when I work with young actors, you know, for example, you know, like this time we had a young actress, you know, who joined this cast, you know, like Regine, who played Jun Young's girlfriend and wife called Lydia. So I would always, you know, and at the start she didn't quite understand what I was saying, and I said, you're not even breathing correctly. How do you play the character if you're not breathing correctly? Because you can tell, you know, when someone, I remember on my second film, Wet Season, there was a scene where the character of Ling, played by Yo Yan Yan, you know, like wakes up from a dream, and it was like sort of pouring rain outside, and then she goes, and she sees a pool of water, you know, and she's trying to clean the water while trying to wake up her father-in-law, and then she calls, ba, ki lai liao, you know, like, wake up, wake up. And the third time she calls, and she hears no response, she knows that he has passed. And then she starts taking, sort of like gasping, and then she starts crying. So if I remember correctly, we did 16 takes. But because it was a set-off, lock-off shot, so there was no camera movement. Actually, after the third take, I stopped looking at the monitor. Because I just put on my earphones and closed my eyes and I listened to, and I said, cut, again, because stop the fake crying, Yo Yan Yan. Because, you know, the fake crying is, it's fake. Because when the emotion is real, the breaths or the pain doesn't come from here or here, it comes from the gut. Which is why when it's real is because it hurts here. So I would close my eyes and say, cut again, and then we do the scene again, she comes in and da-da-da, and then I would just hear, and then when it's right, when the breaths and the pauses are right, I open my eyes and I look at it, I say, that's it, we have it. So in a way, I'm like really sensitive about performance as well, but I've sort of distilled it to that, you know, like all performance and all emotion lies not on the lines, but it's in the pauses and in the breaths.
I think for this particular film, the final film, We Are Strangers, I mean, it's markedly different from the first two films. It's less repressed. I mean, people are more joyous, so all the emotions are more outright. So there shouldn't be that many problems like the one you mentioned about how to express emotions and ideas through breaths and pauses. And
I think that the hard challenge on this one is that it's the first time all these actors had to deal with so many lines on my film, because my films are known to be quite quiet. My films are known to not have like long lines of dialogue. But in this film, both of them have got a lot of dialogue. Yo Yan Yan in particular, there's this 直播 live streaming scenes, and she kept forgetting her lines. because because all this live streaming, most of them are shot at night, so we had to shoot like from sort of like 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. the next morning, or 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. the next morning, and it's not a good time for her, and it's challenging for her. And then for Jiale, there's this whole show flat sort of property agent selling scene where, I told him, I'm shooting all these scenes on a Steadicam and we are not cutting. So you better remember all your lines. And it was a real challenge because for him, he has never had so many lines on my film before, and he was sort of like, you could feel he was stressed, but for the first time he worked really hard. And we sort of, I think we nailed it quite well. And of course there was blocking and all that. So it's, but a lot of what you saw from the previous two films, actually it's still in this film, the quiet moments, I think that is how I express a lot of, I feel some of the most complex emotions that we have in our lives. For example, the death scene on the hospital bed, it's quiet, there are no lines. Like the scene of Yo Yan Yan, like on the bus eating the apple. The scene of her, on the bus where she's just taking a bus and she just looks next to the seat next to her and she starts thinking of her husband or that man that was on the bus, right? There are no lines. But it's, like I feel, but you're right about joy, because on this film I wanted to find joy. I think I had a difficult few years, difficult in a sense that, we just went through the pandemic, and then now we are dealing with a world that is,
completely upside down, maybe.
It's not just upside down, but we are dealing with suffering and pain, and every day, devastating news and heartache. And I just told myself, no, I do not want to, make another film where people are, of course, people would have to deal with pain and suffering in life, right? But I didn't want it to just be, be about repression or depression. Over the course of the past few years, I've seen films, whether it's a jury at a festival and all that, and excellent films, of course, but I feel like there are so many films, great films, where it leaves you choking, It feels like it's so dark and painful that at the end, like, you just feel like, I need air. And I just feel, no, I do not just want to see like poor people and working class people just suffering, I want to feel like that they can deserve joy and romance, and all the small little things. Yes, there's disappointment, there's shame, there's all of these things, but why do we want to just see their exploitation? Why do we want to see it's relentless? Because that's not what I want to, that's not what I want to. I really wanted to feel joy.
But the criticism of the exploitation as brought about by turbocharged capitalism is quite upfront. I mean, it's in this film. I mean, whether it's about the selling of those condos, or maybe the internet sales and TikToks and all. But I feel that, I mean, it's actually quite angrier. I mean, you've made a very angry film in terms of, well, the absurdities of society today, almost Singaporean society today. So, but you are also saying that, well, it's also joy as well. So, do you think, well, it's actually, am I correct to say that actually, well, this film combines joy and fury in equal measures?
It's very interesting that you say that. I really feel this film, because it's the third film that I've made in Singapore. It's the third and final film in the trilogy as well. I really feel this is my love letter to my country, to Singapore, you know, and it's interesting. My first film was made in my 20s, Ilo Ilo. In my 30s, I made Wet Season. This was made in my 40s. You know, I made this when I turned 42, you know, like this month. I made this when I was 41. And I think in your 40s, you're a bit different from when you're 20s and your 30s. You know, like in your 20s, you're just angry and rebellious and you just say what you care and all that. You know, in the 30s, you're experiencing, you know, you're slowly maturing. In the 40s, you accept. When I say accept, just like in a marriage or your relationship with your country, you accept that to love someone means sometimes, you know, like you'll be frustrated, you know, you'll be heartbroken, you know, like there'll be good days, there'll be bad days, but you still continue to love it. And I think this is the feeling that I have. I think whether for what I feel about family, you know, I think we all feel that, you know, like when you're young, you were just fighting your parents and you are this rebellious teenager, and then later on you settle down, you know, you have your own family, and then you start realizing, oh, actually you're being so silly, you know, you start shouting at your own kids. And then, you know, like, and then as you approach, you know, like your 40s and you know, some people use the word mellow down or whatever, and you start to understand, oh, what it means, you know, family or country, that, yes, I love my family, but it gives you the same amount of joy, but grief and heartache, and disappointment and all of that, and I accept it. Yeah.
But, well, since it's called a growing up trilogy, of course, we would presume that it's about Jiale's character growing up, but can we also think of it as growing up, Singapore's growing up trilogy, or the growing up of Singapore in its social development, in the tensions, and so on and so forth?
I think so. You know, it didn't dawn on me so much, but then now, you know, like a lot of times when you make the film, you know, like half of the film, a lot of time when we make films as filmmakers, right, we're half driven by knowing what you're doing and half driven by actually not knowing what you're doing. You know, there's a lot of gut instinct, you know, a lot of subconscious, you know, like behavior that's leading you somewhere. But, you know, now when I look back at these films, you know, like Ilo Ilo was set in 1997 during the Asian financial crisis, during my childhood in the 90s. Wet Season, if you remember, the Malaysian riots and protests that were screening on television, it happened in about 2012, 2013, during that time, so it's set during that time. This film, there was a scene where Singapore celebrates its 60th year of independence last year, 2025, so it's set like now, like it's contemporary. So literally it's that 30 and 40 years that I've captured, you know, like, or my observation of the growing up of a country, the growing up of this boy that you see, you know, from 11, you know, to 16 to 21, and also the growing up of me, you know, as a person. You know, there are a lot of my own emotions, you know, as, you know, over the years, you know, I became from boy to man. I've turned from son to father, yeah, and I feel like a lot of times, yeah, it's my own coming of age. I look at my own foolishness, my own naivety, all these silly things. And it's quite interesting. You know, my wife always says this, you know, you're so childish. But in a way, it's true because, like, men do not, like, grow up. What I'm saying is, like boys do not grow up. You know, I feel like even as a grown-up man, you know, like we're constantly boyish. We're constantly more childish than perhaps our female peers. You I feel like when we are confronting issues or whatever it is, I mean, I give you a very good example. You look at how a guy breaks up and how a girl breaks up. Like, you know, the female would always want to, like, I want to be there, I want to meet you in person, we need to talk about it. The boy would want to avoid it, avoid confrontation, you know, like, they want to text, they want to just not pick up the phone, they want to just let it die, you know, and then ghost the person or something like that. And it's childish, you know, but there's something, you know, like, I didn't feel like I understand that. Yeah. And in a way, when you look at this, you know, I did an interview the other day with a journalist in Hong Kong, and he said there's something that, you know, he was, you know, like in his middle age, you know, and he's also had children and marriage and all that. And he said, you know, a lot of, you know, he connected with this character because a lot of people just assume that just because you're married and you have kids, that a man knows how to be a father and how to be a husband, but it doesn't work that way. You know, like you grow into it, you know, like it's something which you're irresponsible, you think it's easy, it's not, and you figure it out, and it takes, for some people, months, for some people, years. And this is the character in the film.
Actually, that's why you told me yesterday that, of course, the film is dedicated to your wife and your son, which we see at the end of the film. But you also said yesterday that it's more or less a love letter, or maybe it could have been dedicated to your parents as well. So actually, it's also about, well, fathers and mothers and how they...
I think so. You know, like especially, you know, I really hope that this film is, you know, for the everyday men and women. I really hope that my parents will connect with it. I remember, you know, I don't know whether it's I should feel, you know, like happy or sad about it, but, you know, like a few years ago, I produced this film by a first-time Singapore director, He Shu-ming. The film was also nominated for the Golden Horse. It's called Ajuma. It's called Hua Lu Ajuma in Chinese. And then my father went to see the premiere, the big gala premiere, and then the next day in the morning he said, "Son, wow, this film is so good, this Ajuma. Even Daddy cried. It's better than all the films you have made." And, you know, it's funny because I understood what he meant, you see, because, you know, my son is my father is a simple man, you know, like he didn't have very high education. He went to vocational school. You know, he started as a technician, worked his way up as a factory manager. I mean, the father in Ilo, that's my father, you know, like and you know, his favorite films are Jackie Chan sort of like action films, you know. So for him, like, he needs sort of like very mainstream sentiment and all that. And I remember, you know, as I was writing this film and making this film, I said, I hope my father would understand this film.
But he did bring you to see The Last Emperor when you were 4, right?
Yeah, that's the first time I saw a film in a cinema, and cinemas used to be like that, like huge, you know, 800, 1,000-seater, you know. There was a huge Shaw cinema at Beach Road, you know, in Singapore at the time. I'm pretty sure it's probably not my father that decided to go, you know, like it's probably my mother. I think, but that was the first film that I saw in my life at 4 years old. It was Bernardo Bertolucci's The Last Emperor. I went to check the dates because I remember that was the first film I saw. I remember it very well in my head. But then when I look at the dates, it's 1988. I was 4 years old. So they literally brought a 4-year-old kid to watch this 3-hour film, you know, about Puyi, you know, the last emperor in China. But, you know, simple folk, you look at the poster, you have a kid, you know, it's about a young emperor, and you think, oh, this film is for kids. But great, like it probably is what planted cinema in me, because for a 4-year-old to watch on the big screen, those colors, the production design, the opulence, it's the first time a foreign team, foreign production was allowed to film in Forbidden City in China. I remember it really well. That's why like actors like Lisa Lu Yan, like Chen Chong, Zhong Chen, like later on when I got to know them personally, they felt so close to me, because they were sort of like immortalized when I was like young, like those faces, I recognized them for a long, long time.
I'd just like to cycle back a little bit, Anthony, about your comments about how this film could be seen or considered as your love letter to Singapore. Because a bit more markedly compared to the first two films, you really showed Singapore in its various aspects. I remember there's this scene when Boon Kiat, the father, actually told Pi Hua that, well, on a bus, you get to see Singapore so much more. And then we see all these scenes of Little India, and then various neighborhoods, and then ending up in Orchard Street. So we managed to see Singapore in its entirety across social classes and all that. So that's also intentional, right? I mean, in terms of showing Singapore to us, the audience, and also chronicling or archiving what Singapore looks like at this point in time.
It's quite interesting, because when my like post-production team worked on the film, like they saw it like, oh, this is so important because this is gonna be an archive of Singapore in the future, but I wasn't really thinking of that so much, but I felt I wanted to capture, like ordinary life. I wanted to capture, like spaces in Singapore that meant something for me. And this, by the way, is probably one of my favorite scenes in the film, is the bus ride. And even when I wrote it, like I was like, we need to make this work. We need to, because it needs to be moving and romantic and beautiful, but not in a cheap way, The very last shot, just as the sunset is moving, it's across this field, we call it the Padang, and behind is the old Supreme Court and City Hall that's now converted into a National Gallery. And in the past, I used to take a bus, and I always pass by that route. And I always thought that it's the most romantic and most beautiful sort of like side of colonial Singapore, of the city. And I want to capture it. But they've closed down the route. So I literally worked really hard to ask for permission to shoot that visage. I got rejected 5 times, and eventually I got it. I think a lot of these spaces are my own memories as well, of bus rides, of what I felt was truly Singapore, not in a touristic way, but in a way I was thinking, maybe I've always thought Singapore was very ugly and superficial, but I wanted to find beauty in my own country, and that was what I did on this film.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Anthony, maybe we'll just open it up to the floor, theoretically. Okay, so because actually we did receive quite a few questions from the audience, so maybe I'll just, the team actually selected quite a few. So maybe I'll just ask the first one. One of the most frequently asked questions during the past hour or so is the difference between the Chinese title and the English title. We are all strangers, but in Chinese, 我们不是陌生人. So what lies in the difference? Is it, as the member of the audience said, does that reflect your view on relationships in the family? That we are strangers, but we are also not strangers?
I think they are the English and Chinese title actually make perfect bookends for the film, because obviously if you follow the trajectory of the film, this is a family that started as strangers and eventually they're no longer that strange anymore. But at the same time, I feel it's also very much not just the definition of family, but the definition of what I feel like relationships in general. You know, like sometimes the people that you think, you know, are closest to you, whether you are joined by blood or you know, because you have lived years together, you know, as schoolmates or whatever, might not compare to someone that, yeah, that chance encounter or someone that you meet later in life and all that. So, I don't know, it's interesting, you know, like I started having the English title first, We Are All Strangers, and to be really honest, this whole idea of stranger, I feel very deeply myself, because I feel that all the time when I'm back, even in my homeland, or even when I'm in Singapore, I always feel like I can't fit in. You know, I always feel like somehow my value system or the way I look at the world, whatever, is sort of like almost in conflict with what the country or what that society expects of me. Yeah, I remember years ago, I was asked by the Ministry of Education to see if I wanted to do a week-long sort of like lessons with a group of 200 16, 17-year-old students that were selected, you know, from across various schools, and their team was cinema. And then so I was living in London at the time, so I came back and I spent all that time. And then there was an event, you know, like a film event in the evening, and I went, and there was someone, like a film producer, that came to me and said, "Anthony, why are you back in Singapore?" I said, "Oh, because I'm here, because I'm teaching all these 16, 17-year-olds, and we're talking about cinema, and we're talking about how to look at the world." And then I said, "Did they pay you a lot of money?" I said, "No, it was like a token honorarium, and I mean, yeah, and a cheap air ticket. That's all they could afford, right?" And I said, "No, you must be lying. Like, they must be paying you a lot of money. Why would you come and, you know, like, teach 16-year-old kids?" I said, "Because I believe in education, because I believe," yeah, but that is Singapore for you, because in Singapore, everything is transactional. Like, you know, there must be like a value to everything. And which is why, like, I always feel this sense of feeling so disjointed every time, you know, and yeah, and I'm very, very sometimes jealous of a lot of my friends, you know, because I went to a very good boys' school, one of the top schools in Singapore, and a lot of my friends now are lawyers and doctors and bankers, and they're constantly, you know, like buying fine watches, like the really expensive watch that, you know, like Chun Young's boss, the property agent, was wearing, you know, it's from my friend. Really properly expensive.
Friends come in really useful sometimes.
Like $50,000. Yeah, so, and that's the thing, and somehow, yeah, I don't know, maybe if I had followed their life, I would have a different trajectory.
Okay, so Anthony, another question for you about the use of language or language identity. Okay, the question goes, the fusion of languages in Singapore and even its chaotic linguistic system is a distinctive feature of this film, or maybe even all of your films. So, but it's also an everyday reality in Singapore. So the member of the audience would like to know how you understand the relationship between language and identity. I think this is true, but also especially in wet season, how Ling teaches Chinese, but basically the language is basically completely overlooked or maybe even despised by everyone. So what's the relationship between language and identity for you? How do you represent it on screen?
I'm very, very sensitive to language and accents, particularly in Singapore. And I feel very, very strongly about one thing, which is really from the way a person talks, you can hear or you can get a sense of their social class. I can tell you in Singapore, the way someone speaks English, you can probably even tell which school they came from. It's true. And by someone's level of Mandarin or sorts, you could sort of tell. And it's quite fascinating that way, you know, and whether or not someone speaks dialect in Singapore also says a lot about the family that you were born into and all that. It's quite, I think, Singapore and Hong Kong are quite inherently similar in a certain way. We are both sort of like ex-British colonies, you know, and one of the worst things in Singapore that we inherited was the class structure. And you really can feel that because just via language and, you know, like certain terms, you know, you would hear certain people in my films or even when you go to Singapore speaking Singlish and all that. And just by the tongue of someone, it says so much. So I'm very, very particular about not just language, but all this detail. Like when I'm on a bus or whatever, I actually look at the watches people wear. You know, like I always tell, you know, there's a difference between someone, you know, like holding a real Louis Vuitton bag and a fake one, you know, and then there's also a difference between two people having fake Louis Vuitton bags, but one looks so real and the other one is like utterly tacky and fake. So, but it says so much about the pretenders that maybe are a little bit higher up in society, but not quite there yet, and then those that can't even tell the difference. So I'm very, very sensitive to these things, and I feel like all my films sort of like, observe the nuance of class and status and all of that. I'm not sure, I'm pretty sure like for Singaporeans, they would probably connect with these characters more because you understand the nuance. But for foreigners, maybe you know, like you can't distill it so well.
Actually, well, this ties in with another question sent in by another member of the audience. They were actually asking how the pairing of Junyang and Lydia actually speaks about the socioeconomic isms in Singapore. I mean, to pitch a posh upper class girl with a working class boy. Is it deliberate? I mean, in terms of how you're trying to talk about, well, classes are different, but also they could be reconciled, or maybe they could not be reconciled. Is this something that you want to explore with this pairing?
I think it can be reconciled. I really think there's actually a scene where there's a reconciliation. You know, there's a wonderful scene. I think we'll release it at some point. You know, in certain territories in the world, there's still what you call DVDs and Blu-rays. You know, at some point, the deleted scenes will probably be there. There's a wonderful scene between the mother-in-law and Tracy and Junyang. You know, towards the end of the film, and there's a very complex and bittersweet reconciliation of she finally accepting him. You know, or perhaps also forgiving herself. She talks about her own past, and that I find anyway. It's I think it's one of his best scenes. But unfortunately, we cut it out. I think it's possible. I think Singapore is one of the few places where I don't think all the time, but I think there could be possible social mobility. I think it's harder, of course, and you really see this. To be really honest, I feel like the issue in Singapore is not so much about just the widening gap. It's not about super rich and the really poor, because I don't think in Singapore people are that poor. We are not as poor as like Slumdog Millionaire. You know, we have young kids, like picking up rubbish in slums, But the sad thing about the poverty in Singapore, or even what I call middle-class poverty, is that you basically are enslaved to just having to work non-stop, to just sort of like go into this vicious cycle of providing for your kids and hoping that they will have a better future, and then they will continue this vicious cycle, and that for me is the sad thing, like it's that you have to keep pushing on and pushing on and pushing on and pushing on. It's not the fact that that you're literally there begging on the streets. But the thing is, when you're in a country where there isn't much support, if you're really there begging for the streets, because it's so, the system is so well-oiled and orchestrated, and it believes in a certain form of meritocracy that, if you don't work hard enough, it's not the country's fault, it's your problem. And but I do believe that social mobility actually does happen. I mean, just look at, my grandparents' generation and all that, like they all came from like very, very sort of like tough backgrounds and situations. What I worry though is this generation of young kids, because whether you're working class like Jun Yang or middle class and all that, I think in Singapore, everyone has a certain comfort level because your parents are constantly taking care of you and feeling like they have to take care of you. It's odd because I was just talking, I had dinner yesterday, at the festival dinner, and sitting next to me was Huang Jianxing, and the Chinese director who I respect a lot. And I was just telling him, actually, you'll be very, very surprised. Singapore is a British colony. We could be seen to be very progressive and all that, or very modernized, but we are actually more confusion and more traditional and more conservative than perhaps in mainland China in terms of values. And that's the thing, like parents feel they have to constantly give and give and give, and look after the next generation.
I mean, your passion about, Singaporean society or families, that's why I don't believe you when you said that, you're not going to make another film about, about Singapore in general. So, but anyway, okay. There are a lot of questions here that I wish we could continue, but I think we are running out of time. But thanks so much, Anthony, for joining us, for sharing your experiences with us. So another warm applause for Anthony Chen.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming to see the film.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Anthony.